I was born and raised in Michigan, and I never thought that family, the people you trust most in this world, could be the ones to hurt you the deepest. My sister and I grew up in a small town by the lakeside. We were not wealthy, but our parents always gave us enough love to make us feel rich in spirit. I was the older one, always the responsible one, and my sister, 3 years younger than me, was the wild and carefree spirit. When we were children, I used to hold her hand while walking to school. I carried her books, helped her with her homework, and even stood up for her when other kids teased her. I thought that bond we built in those early years would last forever, but I was wrong. As we grew older, our lives took different paths. I stayed close to home, helping my parents with their old house, taking care of them when their health started to fade. My sister moved away, chasing excitement and adventure. She would come back now and then, always with stories about her travels and her successes. I was happy for her, but at the same time, I sometimes felt invisible. I was the one sacrificing, staying behind, while she got to live freely without responsibility. But I never complained. My parents needed me, and I loved them. In their last years, caring for them became my full-time purpose. My father had a bad heart, and my mother's memory was slipping. I cooked, cleaned, and sat with them through the nights when they couldn't sleep. My sister rarely visited, and when she did, she would stay for just a few hours before disappearing again. She would tell me she was too busy with her own life, but she would always remind me that she loved them. I tried to believe that was enough. When my parents passed, I was devastated. They were the center of my world, and suddenly my life felt empty. I expected grief, but what I did not expect was betrayal. My parents had left a will, and they had always told me that everything, the house, the savings, and even the little things of sentimental value, would be split between my sister and me. But when the lawyer read the will, I was shocked. Somehow, everything had been rewritten. The house was left to my sister, the money too, and even the little things like my mother's jewelry and my father's watch. I was left with almost nothing. I could barely understand it. I had been the one caring for them, the one sacrificing my own life, and yet in the end, I was the one left with scraps. I couldn't stop crying when I left that lawyer's office. But what broke me most was what came next. I had a cat, my sweet orange tabby named Oliver. He had been my comfort through all those long nights with my parents. He would curl up on my lap, purring softly, and I felt less alone. That cat was my companion, my family, the one thing that kept me sane. But when my sister came to claim the house, she also claimed Oliver. She said, "Mom and Dad loved him too, and since I'm taking the house, it only makes sense I keep the cat." I couldn't believe it. She knew Oliver was mine. She knew he slept by my side, followed me from room to room, and loved me more than anyone else. But she didn't care. She picked him up, stuffed him in a carrier, and just like that, she was gone, with my inheritance and with my cat. I stood there on the porch that day, watching her car disappear down the road, and I felt like my whole world had been taken away from me. The house that I had cared for, the belongings that held memories, the money that could have given me some security, and even the one living creature that loved me unconditionally, all gone in an instant. I can't tell you how heavy my heart was. I walked back into the empty house, and it didn't feel like home anymore. Without my parents, without Oliver, it was just walls and dust. I sat down in my father's old chair, and for the first time in many years I felt truly alone. I cried until I had no tears left. I thought about all the nights I had stayed awake, caring for my parents, all the sacrifices I had made, and how my sister never lifted a finger. I thought about how she had always been the golden child in their eyes, the one they praised, the one they were proud of, even when she wasn't around. And I thought about myself, the one who was always there but never noticed. It felt like all of that had been erased in a single moment. That night, I could barely sleep. I kept waking up, expecting Oliver to jump on my bed, expecting to hear his soft purring, but he wasn't there. I kept thinking about my sister, about how cold and selfish she had been. She didn't just take things. She took pieces of me, pieces I could never get back. I started to wonder if blood really meant anything, if family ties really mattered when someone could betray you like that. But as the days passed, I realized something. Yes, she had taken the inheritance. Yes, she had even taken Oliver. But she could not take the love I gave to my parents. She could not take the years I spent with them, holding their hands, listening to their stories, comforting them in their last breaths. Those memories belonged to me, and no paper, no will, no greedy sibling could erase that. Still, it hurt, more than I can ever explain. And that was just the beginning of what I would come to face. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I would wake up in the quiet house, and for a few seconds, I would forget everything. I would expect to hear my mother humming in the kitchen or my father coughing as he got out of bed. I would expect Oliver to come running to me, rubbing against my legs, begging for his breakfast. But then the reality would hit me like a heavy stone, and I would remember they were gone. My parents were gone. Oliver was gone. And the house that had always been my safe place now felt like it didn't belong to me anymore. My sister was making arrangements to move in, and I was forced to pack my things. Every drawer I opened, every photo album I flipped through, brought back a flood of memories. My mother's favorite teacups, the quilt she made by hand, the books my father loved to read, the smell of the wood floors. All of it was soaked in history. I had lived those years, breathed them, and cared for them, but none of it was mine anymore. I felt like I was a guest in my own childhood home being pushed out. My sister barely spoke to me during those weeks. When she came, she brought strangers with her, realtors, contractors, people to freshen up the place. She walked through those rooms as if she were inspecting a property, not a home filled with memories of the people who raised us. I watched her point at walls, talk about knocking things down, modernizing, changing everything. It felt like she was erasing my parents' existence. I wanted to scream at her to stop, to remember, but I stayed quiet. That was always my role, quiet, responsible, invisible. The hardest part was knowing Oliver was with her now. At night, I would imagine him curled up somewhere in her new apartment, confused and scared, waiting for me. I would picture him meowing at the door, looking for the person who had been with him since he was a kitten. Did he think I had abandoned him? Did he wonder why I wasn't there anymore? Those thoughts broke me more than losing the house or the money ever could. One evening, I gathered the courage to ask my sister for Oliver back. I told her he's mine. He was always mine. He belongs with me. But she just laughed. She said, "You'll be fine. You don't need him. Besides, he likes me too." That cut deeper than any knife. I knew she didn't care for him the way I did. To her, he was just another thing she could claim, another way to prove she had the upper hand. I cried myself to sleep that night, clutching an old photograph of me holding Oliver on the porch steps, his little paw resting on my arm. I wanted to run to her apartment, knock on her door, and take him back, but I couldn't. I didn't have the strength, and I was afraid of causing a scene that would make things even worse. As the weeks turned into months, I tried to rebuild my life. I moved into a small rental not far from the town. It was nothing like my parents' house, just 2 rooms and a narrow kitchen, but it was all I could afford. I bought second-hand furniture, unpacked my clothes, and tried to make it feel like home. But no matter how I arranged the space, it felt empty. Every night when I came home, the silence pressed on me like a weight. I missed the sound of Oliver's paws on the floor. I missed the warmth of my parents' voices. I missed the sense of belonging I once had. To cope, I started keeping a journal. Every night, I would write letters to my parents, telling them about my day, telling them about the pain I was carrying. Sometimes I would write to Oliver too, as if he could read my words from wherever he was. I would tell him how much I loved him, how much I missed him, and how I hoped he hadn't forgotten me. Writing didn't erase the ache, but it gave me a place to put it. One day, while walking through town, I ran into an old neighbor. She asked me how I was doing, and I tried to smile, but she saw through me. She put her hand on mine and said, "I always admired how you cared for your parents. Don't let anyone take away the truth of what you did." Those words stuck with me. For the first time, I realized that maybe I wasn't invisible after all. Maybe people noticed, even if they didn't say it out loud. Still, the anger toward my sister grew inside me like a storm. I thought about confronting her, about demanding what was rightfully mine. Not just Oliver, but at least part of the inheritance. I had given so much of my life to our parents, and it felt cruel that I was left with nothing. But whenever I thought about facing her, I also thought about all the times in our childhood when I let her have her way. It was a pattern I had never broken. I was the older sister, the protector, the one who gave and gave while she took and took. Maybe I thought this was just the final chapter in a story that had started decades ago. One afternoon, I drove past the old house. My sister had already moved in by then. I slowed down and looked at it from the street. The curtains were different, the paint on the porch was fresh, and flowers I had never seen before sat in pots by the door. It didn't look like my parents' house anymore. It looked like hers. As I sat there in the car, I caught a glimpse of movement in the window. It was Oliver, perched on the sill, staring out. My heart stopped. He looked the same, his orange fur glowing in the sunlight, his green eyes scanning the world outside. For a moment, I thought he might see me, recognize me, leap down and run to the door. But he didn't. He just sat there, calm and still, as if he had accepted this new life. I drove away with tears blurring my vision, and I realized something painful. I might never get him back. But deep down, I also knew something else. My sister could take my inheritance. She could even take Oliver, but she couldn't take my memories or my love. Those belonged to me, and no one could steal them. And so I decided to hold on to that truth, even as my heart remained broken. Time has a strange way of stretching itself when you are lonely. Days feel longer, nights feel endless, and even the smallest silence seems to echo through your bones. That was how my life felt in those first months after leaving my parents' home. Every morning I would wake up to the same little apartment, the same empty rooms, the same quiet that made me ache for the sounds I had once taken for granted. I missed my parents' voices, yes, but I missed Oliver's presence just as much. He had been the rhythm of my days, from the moment he pawed at me to get out of bed to the way he curled against me when I sat down at night. Without him, the hours dragged by like shadows that never lifted. At first, I thought I might drown in that loneliness, but little by little, small things began to change. One afternoon, while I was carrying groceries back from the store, I noticed a stray cat sitting near the alley by my apartment. She was thin, her fur a patchy gray, and her eyes were cautious but curious. She didn't run away when I stopped, just sat there watching me. Something in her reminded me of Oliver, though she was nothing like him in color or shape. I found myself kneeling down and speaking softly as if she might understand. That became a habit. Every time I came home from shopping, I would see her near the alley. At first, she kept her distance, but after a while, she grew bold enough to approach. I started leaving bits of food out for her, and soon she began waiting for me at the same spot. I didn't bring her inside, she was too wild for that, but she became a small piece of comfort. I called her Misty, though I knew she wasn't truly mine. Somehow, she made me feel less invisible, as though even in my loneliness, someone was noticing me. Around that time, I also began to see more of my neighbors. Living in an apartment building was different from being in a family house. People came and went, carrying their own stories, and at first I kept to myself. But one evening, the woman across the hall, Mrs. Green, knocked on my door with a plate of cookies. She was older than me, a widow who lived alone, and she told me she thought I might like some company. I can't explain how much that small gesture meant to me. We sat together in my little kitchen, sipping tea and eating cookies, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like someone saw me, truly saw me. We began having tea together once or twice a week, and slowly I began to realize that maybe life was offering me a chance to build something new, even in the ruins of what I had lost. Still, my sister was always in the back of my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about her, about the coldness in her voice when she refused to give Oliver back, about the way she had erased me from our parents' will. Some days I burned with anger, imagining myself marching up to her door, demanding justice. Other days I was swallowed by sadness, wondering if maybe I had been foolish to expect anything different. Our whole lives, she had taken what she wanted while I stood aside. Why would adulthood be any different? But one night, while writing in my journal, I realized something that shifted me. I had been pouring all of my energy into thinking about what she had done, how she had wronged me, how she had taken from me. And yet, all that thinking did nothing to heal me. It only gave her more power over my heart. I wrote on the page, "She took things, but she cannot take me. I am still here. I am still standing." When I read those words back to myself, I felt a small spark of strength. Maybe I thought healing doesn't come from holding on to anger. Maybe it comes from learning how to live without what was stolen, from finding a way to keep going anyway. The very next morning, I took a long walk along the lake. The water shimmered under the sunlight, and the breeze carried the smell of pine trees. It was the same lake I had walked along as a girl, holding my sister's hand back when we were still close. I thought about those days, about how much I had loved her once, and for a brief moment I wished we could go back. But then I remembered the woman she had become, the choices she had made, and I knew that going back was impossible. What I could do, however, was move forward. I decided that day that I would no longer let her betrayal define every corner of my life. I would not let her shadow linger over every smile I might find. Instead, I would search for new light, even if it came in small flickers. In the weeks that followed, I signed up for a quilting group at the local community center. At first, I was nervous, afraid of walking into a room full of strangers, but the women there welcomed me warmly. We sat around long tables, stitching pieces of fabric together, sharing stories and laughing about small things. With every stitch, I felt a tiny piece of myself being mended too. I realized how long it had been since I had laughed freely, without the heaviness of sorrow pressing down on me. And though my heart still ached for Oliver, I began to feel a little lighter. Sometimes, late at night, I would still dream of him, dream of his soft fur, his purring, the way he used to paw at my blanket. I would wake up with tears in my eyes, but now there was also gratitude. Gratitude that I had known such a love, gratitude that I had those memories. even if they were bittersweet. Life had taken much from me, yes, but it had not taken everything. I still had pieces worth holding on to, and I still had the chance to build something new. That realization was not the end of my journey, but it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I was no longer only the woman who had been betrayed, but also the woman who chose to rise, even when her heart was broken. Life has a way of testing us just when we start to feel a little steadier. After I joined the quilting group and made a few friends at the community center, I began to think maybe I could live quietly, even happily, without the weight of my sister's betrayal crushing me every day. I wasn't healed, not fully, but I was moving forward, and that in itself felt like a victory. But healing is never a straight road, and one afternoon, as I was walking back from the store with my groceries, I saw something that ripped open all the wounds I had worked so hard to close. There, on the other side of the street, was my sister. She was holding Oliver in her arms. My heart nearly stopped. His orange fur was still the same bright shade I remembered, his green eyes still sharp and curious, but his body looked thinner, and there was a tiredness about him I didn't recognize. He squirmed in her arms as if he wanted to get down, and for a moment his eyes locked with mine. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, clutching my grocery bag so tightly I thought it would burst. My sister hadn't seen me yet, and I almost wanted to turn and run before she did, but then she looked up and our eyes met. Her smile froze into something stiff and cold, the way it always did when she didn't want to show what she was really feeling. "Well, look who it is," she said as she crossed the street. My voice trembled, but I managed to whisper, "Oliver," he meowed when he heard my voice, a soft sound that cut straight into my chest. I reached out my hand instinctively, and he stretched his neck as if to touch me, but my sister pulled him back against her. "He's mine now," she said firmly, as though she had anticipated my every thought. "Don't even think about it." For a moment, I thought I might break down right there on the sidewalk. All the months of loneliness, all the sleepless nights, all the quiet tears I had shed for that cat came flooding back. I wanted to scream at her, to grab him and run, to finally take back what was mine, but I just stood there trembling. "You don't care for him the way I do," I whispered. "You only took him to hurt me." Her lips curved into a smirk. "Maybe. But it doesn't matter now, does it? He's comfortable with me. He's adjusted. You should let it go." And with that, she turned and walked away, Oliver still squirming in her arms. I watched until they disappeared down the street, and then I sank onto the curb, my groceries spilled around me, tears pouring down my face. It felt like I had lost him all over again. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of that encounter. The way Oliver had looked at me, the way he had stretched his neck toward me, the way my sister had pulled him away. My heart screamed for justice, but my body felt powerless. I kept asking myself why she hated me so much. What had I ever done to deserve this cruelty? I had spent years caring for our parents, years sacrificing my own life, and she had taken everything from me as if my devotion meant nothing. Was it jealousy? Was it spite? Or was it simply her nature to take and take until there was nothing left for anyone else? The next morning, Mrs. Green knocked on my door. She must have heard me crying the night before because she didn't even ask what was wrong. She just held my hand and said, "Don't let her poison your soul. Some people will never change, but that doesn't mean you have to stay trapped in their shadow." Those words stayed with me all day. I wanted to believe them, but it was hard. My anger toward my sister burned like fire, and the pain of losing Oliver was as sharp as ever. I decided to write another letter in my journal, But this time, instead of writing to my parents or to Oliver, I wrote to my sister. I poured out everything I had never said aloud. The anger, the betrayal, the grief. I wrote that she had taken things, but she could never erase the love I carried in my heart. I wrote that I pitied her because someone who can only find joy by hurting others will never truly know happiness. And I wrote that, whether she realized it or not, one day she would face the consequences of her selfishness. When I finished, I didn't send the letter. I tore it up, but the act of writing it released something in me. For the first time, I felt like I had spoken my truth, even if only to myself. Weeks passed, and I avoided the places where I thought I might run into her again. I focused on my quilting, on Misty the stray, who still waited for me outside, on the small friendships I was nurturing. Slowly, the tightness in my chest began to ease again, but fate wasn't done testing me. One morning, as I was sitting with the quilting group, one of the women mentioned a neighborhood yard sale happening the next weekend. I decided to go, thinking it might be a pleasant distraction. But as I wandered through the tables of trinkets and old furniture, I suddenly froze. There, spread out on one table, were items I recognized: my mother's teacups, my father's watch, even the quilt my mother had sewn by hand. My sister was selling them. My throat closed up, and I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. These weren't just objects. They were pieces of my parents, pieces of my life. To see them laid out like cheap merchandise for strangers to paw through was more than I could bear. I wanted to shout, to sweep everything off the table and clutch it to my chest, but my legs wouldn't move. My sister spotted me then, and her eyes narrowed. She crossed her arms and said, "Don't start. You gave up your claim when you walked away." Her words stung, but something inside me hardened. I realized she would never see me, never acknowledge my sacrifice, never treat me with the respect I deserved. To her, I was nothing but an obstacle, someone to be brushed aside. And in that moment, I understood that if I kept holding on to the hope that she might change, I would keep breaking my own heart. So I turned and walked away, tears streaming down my face, but with a new determination forming in my soul. She could sell every object. She could strip the house bare. She could even keep Oliver. But she would never own my memories, and she would never own me. After that day at the yard sale, something inside me shifted. I had walked away from the sight of my mother's teacups, my father's watch, and the quilt my mother's hands had stitched with love, and though my heart had cracked open again, I also felt a strange sense of clarity. It was as if life itself had finally made me see the truth, that my sister had no respect for the past, no sense of family, no appreciation for the sacrifices others made for her. And if I continued to measure my worth by what she had taken from me, I would never be free. For weeks after, I carried that thought like a lantern in the dark. I began to tell myself each morning, she cannot take what lives inside of me. At first, it felt like empty words, but with time I started to believe them. I still hurt, of course. The pain of losing Oliver never left me. But instead of letting that pain hollow me out, I began to weave it into my days like a thread, something that reminded me of what I had endured and what I had survived. My quilting group became a sanctuary. The women there were kind, some of them carrying scars of their own, and little by little I began to share my story with them. I told them about my parents, about how I had cared for them until their last breath. I told them about my sister and the inheritance, about Oliver, about the betrayal that had nearly broken me. They listened without judgment, some with tears in their eyes, others nodding quietly, as if they understood too well the kind of wounds family can inflict. One of the women, Clara, who had lost her husband and been left with nothing by his unkind relatives, put her hand on mine and said, "You've already done the hardest thing, loving without expecting anything back. That is strength, not weakness." Her words sank deep into me. For so long, I had thought of myself as the weak one, the one who always gave and never fought, the one who was invisible. But maybe she was right. Maybe my strength was not in taking, but in giving, not in winning battles, but in carrying love through the worst storms. Around that same time, Misty, the little gray stray who had been waiting for me outside the alley, began to trust me more. One evening, she followed me all the way up the stairs to my apartment door. I hesitated, wondering if I should let her in, and then I opened the door and stepped aside. She slipped in cautiously, her tail twitching, and began exploring the small rooms. By the end of the night, she was curled up on the rug as if she had been there her whole life. From that day forward, Misty was mine, not just in name but in heart. She wasn't Oliver, and I never wanted her to replace him. But she became a companion, a reminder that love has a way of finding us even when we feel abandoned. Her soft purrs filled some of the silence, and her watchful eyes made the apartment feel less empty. Slowly, with Misty by my side, I began to rebuild a rhythm. I woke up each morning with purpose. I cooked small meals that I actually enjoyed. I attended quilting every week. And I spent evenings writing in my journal, not just about pain, but about gratitude too. I wrote about the sunsets over the lake, about Mrs. Green's laughter when we shared tea, about the comfort of Misty's fur against my hand. These small blessings did not erase my loss, but they reminded me that life still held beauty if I chose to see it. Yet, even as I grew stronger, I knew my story with my sister was not finished. I would hear bits of news from people in town, that she was making changes to the house, that she was throwing parties, that she was showing off the inheritance as if it were her achievement alone. Each time I heard her name, the old bitterness stirred. But instead of letting it consume me, I began to pray. Not prayers for revenge, but prayers for release. "Let me carry peace," I whispered at night. "Let me rise above what she has done." There were nights when I failed, when anger gnawed at me like a hungry animal, when I wanted nothing more than to see her suffer the way I had suffered. But then I would look at Misty sleeping soundly beside me, and I would remember that love, even in its smallest form, was more powerful than hate. One Sunday after church, I found myself speaking to the pastor about forgiveness. I asked him how someone could possibly forgive a person who had taken everything from them. He looked at me kindly and said, "Forgiveness doesn't mean excusing what they did. It doesn't mean you forget or even reconcile. Forgiveness means you stop carrying their sin inside your heart. It means you set yourself free." His words settled into me like seeds. I didn't forgive her that day or even the next, but I began to see forgiveness not as a gift to my sister, but as a gift to myself. I had already lost so much. Why should I also lose the rest of my life by clinging to bitterness? The turning point came a few weeks later when I walked by the lake at dusk. The sky was painted in streaks of pink and gold, and the water rippled gently against the shore. I sat on a bench and thought about my parents. I thought about their love, their laughter, the sacrifices they had made, and the trust they had put in me during their last years. And I realized something. They would not want me to live in sorrow. They would not want me to be trapped in anger over my sister's cruelty. They would want me to live with dignity, with kindness, with strength. I closed my eyes and whispered, "I forgive her." The words felt heavy, almost impossible, but the moment I spoke them, I felt a strange lightness in my chest. Forgiveness didn't erase what she had done. It didn't bring Oliver back or return the inheritance or mend the relationship we once had. but it freed me from the chain that tied me to her every action. For the first time in a long while, I breathed deeply without feeling crushed by grief. And in that breath, I knew I was beginning to heal in a way I never had before. Forgiveness is not a single moment. It is something you must practice again and again, and I learned that soon after I whispered those words by the lake. For a time, I felt lighter, as though the heavy chains I had carried around my heart were loosening. I went about my days with a little more ease, smiling at neighbors, laughing more with Mrs. Green, even humming to myself as I quilted. Misty curled by my side at night, and I found peace in her steady breathing. But life has a way of circling back to test the lessons we claim to have learned, and one autumn afternoon, I found myself standing face to face with my sister again. It happened at the grocery store of all places. I was pushing my cart down the aisle, choosing apples, when I heard a familiar laugh. I turned my head, and there she was, standing by the bakery section, talking loudly to a friend. At her feet sat Oliver, on a leash like a dog, looking restless and out of place. My heart twisted the moment I saw him. He looked thinner than I remembered, his coat less glossy and his eyes tired. He didn't belong there among the noise and bustle. He had always been a homebody, happiest curled in a quiet corner. I froze, torn between walking away and confronting her, but before I could decide, she saw me. Her expression hardened instantly, the way it always did when she looked at me. "Well, if it isn't the martyr herself," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Her friend looked uncomfortable and excused herself quickly, leaving the two of us staring at one another in the middle of the store. My hands trembled on the cart, but this time something inside me was different. I wasn't the broken woman who had wept on the sidewalk months ago. I wasn't the invisible sister who had always yielded. I stood a little straighter and said softly but firmly, "You don't have to call me names. I know what you did, and I've made my peace with it." For a moment, she looked surprised, as if she expected me to beg or cry. Then she smirked. "Peace? Don't tell me you've forgiven me." I swallowed hard, my eyes flicking down to Oliver, who was pawing at the leash and looking at me with those same green eyes that once comforted me through sleepless nights. "Yes," I said, my voice steady though my chest burned. "I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace." The smirk faltered for just a second, and I saw something in her eyes, confusion, maybe even a flicker of guilt, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. She scoffed and said, "Keep telling yourself that." Then she tugged on Oliver's leash and turned away. My knees felt weak, but I stood my ground. I didn't chase her. I didn't beg for Oliver. I just let her go, because in that moment I realized that forgiveness truly was my power. She could keep the house, the money, the heirlooms, even the cat, but she could no longer keep me chained to her cruelty. That night I cried, not out of anger, but out of release. I had faced her and spoken my truth without breaking. I had seen Oliver again, and though it hurt that he was still with her, I also knew that love doesn't vanish with distance. The bond he and I shared would live in me forever, even if I never held him in my arms again. Days turned into weeks, and as autumn leaves fell and the air grew crisp, I leaned into the life I was building. The quilting group asked me to lead a small project, and I found joy in guiding others, something I never thought I would do. Misty grew healthier and more affectionate, filling my little home with her soft presence. And sometimes in quiet moments, I imagined Oliver resting peacefully wherever he was, and I whispered a prayer for him, hoping he felt loved still. One evening, Mrs. Green and I sat together, sipping tea, and she said something that stayed with me. You know, dear, sometimes the family we're born with fails us. But life has a way of giving us a different kind of family, the ones who choose to love us, the ones we gather along the way. I thought about my quilting friends, about Mrs. Green, about Misty, and I realized she was right. My sister had taken so much, but she had also pushed me into building something new, something chosen, something maybe even stronger. Still, forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and it didn't mean I wasn't tested again. A month later, I received a letter in the mail, not from my sister, but from a lawyer. It turned out she wanted to sell my parents' house and needed my signature for some lingering paperwork. I stared at that letter for a long time, anger rising in me again. She had already taken everything, and now she wanted my help to finalize it. My first instinct was to refuse, to crumple it up and throw it away, but then I thought about what my parents would have wanted. They would not have wanted endless battles between their daughters. They would have wanted peace. So I signed it, not for her sake, but for my own. As I slipped it into the envelope, I whispered, "This is the last thing you will ever take from me." And I meant it. With that signature, I let go of the house, the inheritance, all of it. I turned the page in my heart. I knew now that my life was no longer tied to hers, no longer dependent on what she gave or what she stole. I was free to move forward, to live fully, to love deeply, and to be at peace with myself. When I look back now, I realize that life rarely unfolds the way we expect. And sometimes the greatest heartaches are the very things that shape us into who we are meant to be. My sister took so much from me: money, heirlooms, memories, even the cat I loved. But in doing so, she unknowingly gave me something greater, the chance to rediscover myself. In the beginning, I felt like nothing but a shadow of who I used to be. I was lost, grieving not only for my parents, but also for the betrayal of my own blood. Yet, through the pain, I uncovered a strength I never knew I had. I learned that I could stand on my own 2 feet, that I could make a home from nothing, that I could find joy again in small, simple things like quilting, gardening, or sipping tea with a friend on a quiet afternoon. The ache of loss never fully disappears. It still tugs at me some nights when I imagine Oliver curled up on the foot of my bed, or when I think of the old family photos now tucked away in her possession. But grief has softened with time, like sharp glass edges that become smoother when carried by the waves. I no longer wake each morning with bitterness. Instead, I wake with gratitude for what remains and for what I have built anew. Forgiveness, I have found, is not about excusing what someone has done. It is about refusing to let their actions poison your spirit. My sister may never apologize. She may never even recognize the depth of the hurt she caused, but that no longer matters. I have stopped waiting for her remorse. Instead, I have chosen to live in a way that honors my parents, in a way that brings kindness into a world that already has too much cruelty. I've chosen to fill my days with warmth and connection, to tend to my friendships, to care for Misty who curls against me with trust, and to pour my love into the things I can still touch and nurture. And yes, sometimes I still think of Oliver. I picture him sunbathing on a windowsill, his fur glowing in the light. I imagine him chasing shadows across the floor, or resting quietly with his green eyes half closed in contentment. Though he is not with me, he remains part of me. Love is like that. It does not vanish because of distance or circumstance. It becomes woven into who you are, stitched into the fabric of your heart. In that way, he will always be mine, just as my parents will always be mine, even though they are gone. Life is not measured by what we keep, but by what we give and what we carry within us. I used to think my inheritance was the money, the house, the keepsakes, but now I see that my true inheritance was something deeper. It was the lessons my parents taught me through their example. Resilience, kindness, and the ability to keep going even when the path is rough. It was the strength to forgive without forgetting, to love without conditions, and to endure without becoming hard. Those things cannot be stolen, no matter how much someone may try. Michigan winters are long, but they always give way to spring. I've come to see my journey in the same way. There were seasons of cold, of loneliness, of bitter winds that cut deep, but there was also renewal waiting just ahead. Flowers bloom again, rivers thaw, and life finds a way to keep moving. I, too, have kept moving. I've stitched quilts that now cover children in need. I've laughed around tables with friends who feel more like family, and I've tended to a garden that rewards me with bright blooms each summer. These are the treasures I hold now, the treasures no one can take. If I were to leave behind a message for those who hear my story, it would be this: do not measure your worth by what others steal from you, but by what you continue to build despite the loss. Do not let bitterness take root in your heart, for it will only weigh you down. Choose instead to forgive, not for them, but for yourself, so that your spirit can be light and your days can still be filled with joy. And remember, family is not always defined by blood. Sometimes it is found in neighbors who check on you, in friends who make you laugh, or even in the soft purr of a cat who chooses your lap as home. My sister may have taken my inheritance and my cat, but she did not take my hope, my kindness, or my ability to love. Those things are mine to keep, and I will carry them with me until the end of my days. And when I finally join my parents in the peace beyond this life, I believe they will look at me and say, "You did well, daughter. You lived with grace." That thought is enough to keep me warm, even on the coldest Michigan nights.